This is a rebroadcast of the Eau Claire City Council work session meeting. The audio for this program can be heard on WRFP LP 101.9 FM.
It's late, we'll get going. This will be about a 45-minute session. Are you going?
We're ready.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, and certainly welcome to, as we continue to revitalize City Hall. You have this year the first meeting with the new tables. This is local ash wood from the that you've heard about earlier this evening. And the tables are built in such a way that we're actually able to take off the tops and move them so that we can still use the room in a more traditional setting as well. So welcome to this. So this is all about some new things. We have new tables. This is also a new process for the budget. What we're trying is something a little bit different based upon feedback that we've received over the last couple of years. And this is a preliminary, higher level discussion about the budget. Historically, we've held budget meetings, and during those meetings, essentially the manager has presented his or her budget for review and comment, and then eventually there's adoption to it. Last year you broke out the process, so we were doing the CIP separately from the operating budget. But this is pre all of that. And what we want to do tonight is talk a little bit about the budget in the sense that it is a very important document. It certainly embodies your values and your priorities, and for us as staff it becomes the roadmap or the guidelines for the operations that we do. Tonight we're going to review with you the policies as they relate to debt and fund balance, because they do drive significantly. Remember last year you spent a lot of time and work putting together a debt and fund balance policy. And we're also governed by formulas from the state of Wisconsin between levy limits and expenditure restraint. There's some very narrow windows for what we can do in terms of tax levy. As a general concept, you may recall that we essentially cannot levy, we can't change our levy unless there's net new taxes. So the amount of money that the city of Eau Claire receives from year to year on a tax levy is exactly the same unless there's net new construction in the community. And then from an expenditure restraint program, we cannot increase our expenditures from year over year greater than the rate of inflation, and as you're aware, that can be challenging given the inflation rates that we've had certainly the last year or so. What we're going to do is take a look at some of the historical perspectives of revenue and expenses as they relate to the formulas and the policy limits that you've put in place. But we've also done something a little bit different. We're taking 5-year projections going forward. And so we've taken basically our historical view and projected that out 5 years and try to see how that fits with the policies. And really what comes out of that are some pretty clear indications of what we can do and can't do. And Jay has put a lot of time and effort into making these projections and putting them into some graphic form so that you can kind of see how those formulas work, how our historical spending and revenues fit in with that, and when we project 5 years forward, how that looks to the future. So we'll do all of that, and then coming out of that, we will become a pretty clear picture what we can do and can't do, and we're going to be looking for your guidance and direction in terms of a higher level policy perspective of where we should go with the CIP and also the operating budget. And then this is also the time and place so that when we're through with this, if there are CIP projects that you want to really make sure that we consider, because what we're going to do is take this policy level, higher level direction from you tonight, and then we will go through the process with staff of reviewing the requests and then be coming back to you with a recommended CIP and then ultimately a budget, which you will also have the opportunity to review, modify, amend before making a final, approved CIP and budget. So sit back, enjoy the ride as Jay's going to take you through some graphical presentations of our numbers and where we're at. We've tried to make it clear and simple. But then at the end, we will be looking for some feedback from you in terms of kind of where we should be going with some of the bigger concepts. And then also, if there's particular CIP projects you want to make sure we, contemplate or try to factor in, we'd be looking for that feedback too. So that's a little bit of where we're going tonight. We're going to try really hard to be done with this in 15 minutes. And
Yay!
okay, 45. So with that, Jay, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dale. One of the things that we're trying to do is involve the city council in more of a proactive, more in a planning role along with staff in both CIP as well as budget discussions, rather than just, I think as Dale said, rather than just handing you a budget and asking you to react to it and say we like it or we don't like it. We'd rather get your input up front so that we can develop documents that hopefully meet your wishes with little revision if possible. So I apologize in advance because I was making last minute changes, which you should never do to a document, and I had 2 versions of this, and I hope I have the right version up right now. So I apologize if all of a sudden I go, oh, that's not right. So anyway, just a little bit about where we've been. Many of you have seen these slides before. You're going to see them again, but I think it's important to understand the base of the City of Eau Claire's operating budget. The first slide is looking at our revenue sources, and as you can see, about 62% of our general fund revenue comes from property taxes. We are, in the state of Wisconsin, municipalities are largely restricted in their revenue sources, and their primary revenue source is the property tax. The next largest revenue source is intergovernmental revenue, and what is that? That's primarily shared revenue from the state of Wisconsin, and as many of you who have been on the council for a while know, that has been decreasing dramatically over the last 20 years, and continues to decrease. We've been hit with $1 million cuts in shared revenues, I think twice in the last 10 years. So it's a significant source of revenue, but also one that is not very stable. And then our other revenue sources, we've got other intergovernmental charges, some cooperative relationships with Eau Claire County, licenses and permits, but we've got a smattering of other sources of revenue, none of them nearly as significant as either property taxes or the intergovernmental sources. On the expenditure side, about 64% of our budget is people. We are in a service business. The business that we're in is driven by people. Contractual services represents about 12% of our budget, and other financing uses about 18% of our budget. Supplies, really small. I mean, 3% of our budget. So if you're going to make a meaningful reduction in our budget, in the budgets, it's not going to be going after supplies. It really is people. Just looking at, again, total expenditures broken out by functional areas. Public safety, police and fire represent about 45% of our budget. They are by far the largest single component of our budget. Public works represents about 16%, parks and forestry about 8%, general government 12%, and we've got debt service at about 12% also. So public safety, police and fire are the largest portions of our budget, followed by public works and general government, and then parks and recreation. In terms of just operating expenditures, so now I've stripped out debt service out of the picture. Personnel services represent about 78% of our budget. So debt service is really something that we're locked into. You can't change that in any given year. You can change future years, but you can't change the year that we're in or the year that we're going to be budgeting for. So if you take a look at the rest of the pie, about 78% of that is represented by people. And then again, breaking that down, once I strip debt service out, Public safety represents about 52% of our budget, again, followed by public works at about 18% and general government at about 13.5%. Again, a little bit of revenue history, and some of this becomes important as we get into the projections moving forward. But traditionally, on the revenue side of our budget, we over-realize our revenue. We tend to be somewhat conservative in our revenue estimates because we don't want to come up short at the end of the year. And as you can see, the red line represents our actual revenues, and the blue line represents our budget. So for almost all of the years, other than a little blip in 2010, 2011, the blue line is pretty much below the red line, which is where we would like to see it. The other thing you can see is that over time, since about 2009, our actual and our budgets are running closer and closer together, and that's because with levy limits and other economic factors, we've gotten a little bit more aggressive in our revenue estimates in order to continue to make the budget balance. So those numbers, have started running closer and closer together. On the expenditure side, similar trends. We tend to be conservative in our estimates of expenditures, and traditionally our actual expenditures are less than our budgeted expenditures. Typically, that's been running on average in the neighborhood of about 3% under our budgeted expenditures, and once again, that's the way we like to see it. We don't like to exceed our budgets, although in some areas, there are areas where that can be a little bit beyond our control. Who knows when we're going to get an 18-inch snowfall or several of them at the end of the year, and
3 presidential visits on a day.
3 presidential visits on a day, whatever it might be. So, things do happen, but as you can see, over the last 10 years, we have a history of underexpending our budgets. Where we start running into problems is demonstrated in this graph, and the red line at the top shows our operating expenditures over the last 10 years, the solid red line. The dashed line is just a trend line that's generated by Excel. The solid blue line represents our property tax revenue, and the dashed blue line represents a trend line. And as you can see, the operating expenditures are increasing at a pretty consistent rate. The property tax revenue, on the other hand, is pretty stable. That line's pretty flat. So the gap that we have between our property tax, the blue line is non-property tax revenue. So the gap between the non-property tax revenue and our operating expenditures continues to grow. And the only way we make that up is through the property tax. So, if you start looking forward, you can see that those lines start getting further and further apart, which means that in order to close that gap, we need to look at either stabilizing that operating expense line or increasing property taxes. So when I put together the long-range fiscal projections, and again, when I'm talking long range, I'm talking 5 years. And get out my crystal ball. I've made some key assumptions that I want to share with all of you because they're important. First of all, the first assumption is that we're going to levy at the maximum of the statutory limit. That will generate on average over the next 5 years about $474,000 a year. I've assumed that no decrease in shared revenues. Don't have any control over that. Hopefully there won't be any further decreases, but if they do, then that certainly will affect any of these projections. I've also assumed that the personal property tax remains in place. There was legislation last year to eliminate the personal property tax. So I am assuming that remains there. I'm also assuming that our fine and forfeiture revenue decreases by about 2% per year. That's about $40,000. Why is that? Well, we're talking about parking changes downtown and some of the snow parking changes that were made regarding odd even parking and those time periods. Those things are decreasing our fine and forfeiture revenue. The parking change actually was a very significant decrease in our fine and forfeiture revenue. I'm assuming that recreation fees increase at about 3% per year. That averages about $24,000 over the per year over the 5 years. Assuming that fire and rescue fees increase 5% per year. That averages $142,000 per year over the 5-year period. Our population continues to age, and we, as Lyle can attest to, we get more and more calls for service every single year, and the trend on fire and rescue fees has been about 5% per year. But I'm also assuming that investment earnings increase about 10% per year. That sounds like a big percentage increase, but when interest rates right now, our interest rates at least are around 0.75%, a 10% increase isn't very much. So, and that amounts to about $91,000 per year. So on the revenue side, those are some key assumptions that went into building the model.
And those assumptions are per year times 5 years?
Yes.
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 Jay, I have a question about the, maybe the fine assumption. And I don't know if you or maybe Mr. Klinkhammer would know. My understanding is the library was able to acquire something new so that they could maybe do better fine collectment, if that's the collection, excuse me. Do you think that's gonna have an impact on that revenue?
That would, oh, go ahead.
I'm not sure what that is, but that's, the fine and forfeiture revenue from the library is pretty insignificant.
And it wouldn't play.
It wouldn't be in the general fund
It wouldn't be in the
either.
general fund, that would come through the library board in their budget.
Okay, thank you.
On the expenditure side, assumptions that have gone into the model include that wages will increase on average 1.5% per year. We have contracts settled through 2017, and that is the agreed upon settlement with the collective bargaining units for 2017. It's actually a 2% January 1 and 2% July 1, but an annualized amount is 1.5% based upon those. That averages $440,000.
I think you meant 1 and 1.
One and one,
Yeah,
yeah, 1 and 1, sorry. That averages $440,000 over the 5-year, per year, over the 5-year projection. Health insurance increases, we're estimating at 5% per year. That's a pretty conservative projection, but we've done an excellent job of keeping health insurance increases in check over the course of the last 5 to 10 years. But even at 5% per year, that's $495,000 per year over every year of this projection. Fleet charges going up 2% a year, that's about $65,000. Utility costs at about 5% per year, that's about $70,000. Supplies going up about 2%. We're also assuming no increase in operating transfers. So we don't have any increase in here in our support for transit, no increase in our support for Hobbs or any of the other budgets where we transfer operating funds. So a graph I showed you a little while ago, we talked about underexpending or over-realizing revenue. This model assumes that will over-realize our revenue by 1% per year. And on the expenditure side, it also is assuming that we'll be 3% under budget every year. Also assuming that all debt planned in the CIP will be issued. That hasn't always been the case, and it may not be the case. But for the purposes of this, we're making that assumption, and also assuming that all capital transfers will be made. So if we throw that all into the mixer, what do we end up with? Well, this is looking at where we've been, and the highlighted row, talks about is the operations and the capital transfers. As you can see, those have steadily gone up from 2012 to 2016, from 51 million to 55 million. Capital transfer line has pretty consistently been in that 2.8, about 2.8, 2.9 million dollar range. Our operating budget has increased pretty steadily. Property tax revenue has gone up from 24.3 million to 26.3 million. You can see that our debt service, our post-2005 debt service has increased from about 3.8 to about 5.6 million. This is, and then that surplus or deficit, that's basically what we're funding with our fund balance, which according to the City Council's fund balance policy, we can use fund balance to fund capital projects, but we should not be using fund balance to pay for operating expenditures. So if we start looking forward now, where I see this going is that our operations budget will continue to need to increase. We showed you what the revenue sources were. We showed you what the expenditures are going to be going up, and we believe that our operations budget will continue to increase. The capital transfer numbers that are in here are based upon the 2016 through 2020 CIP, which is our most recently adopted capital program. And then our debt service is assuming that we fund all of the projects in that CIP and issue debt for the projects we intended that we would issue debt for. So then we come up with basically a gap of or a deficit that needs to be funded through property taxes. So we're looking at non-property tax revenue continue to grow at a fairly slow rate. Our non-property tax revenue, as I indicated before, is not increasing dramatically. The tax levy will increase at about 1.5% per year, which is what we're estimating the maximum to be under the statutory levy limit. Debt service will continue to go up as well. The line that I want to draw your attention to is the fund balance above below the capital transfer. What this is telling us is that under this scenario, we would need to transfer more money from fund balance than we're spending on capital, which would be a violation of our fund balance policy. So in 2017, we would need to use about $122,000 of fund balance for operations. In 2018 through 2021, that increases to about an average of $450,000 per year that we would need to use a fund balance to fund operations. Well,
Why is that?
Why is that? Because our expenses are growing faster than our property tax and non-property tax revenue.
Your bottom line.
That line is, those lines are diverging. So as we go out into the future, if we want to continue, again, you have to go back to all the assumptions.
Right, so if you go back to all the assumptions, right, of the wage increase and health insurance and what this is saying is that each year, this is essentially the gap that we would have to deal with. Otherwise, and if we don't deal with this prospectively going out, then that would be at the end of the year, just to balance our books and comply with state law, we would have to transfer from the fund balance to make.
So
Why
now
does it jump so fast between 17 and 18?
I
That's
can't.
really what
I can't tell you for sure exactly, Kathy, why it's jumping. Now I do want to emphasize something. This isn't saying that we have to decrease our current budgets.
Right.
Okay, I want to make sure, and you got that, Julian? Okay. What this is saying is that we have to reduce the increase. Okay, So I've projected, as you see, the operations budget is going from 53 million to 56 million. It's continuing to increase. What this is saying is we have to kind of reduce that increase, if you will. So that, oh, Dave.
Just one thing on your property tax projections, you talked about a 1.5%, which is about what we can do. Did you factor in any of the new construction going on and those projects that are increasing our property values as well? Has that been considered in some of this?
Well, we don't get more property tax revenue when property values go up.
Has to be the net new,
Because-
the net new construction?
Right, because the city council sets a tax levy, okay? The tax rate that people pay is just basically basic division. Divide the tax levy by the assessed value of the community. If the tax rate stayed the same, as values went up, we would get more money. But the tax rate changes every single year. And as Dale said, the only way we can increase the tax levy is through that net new construction, and that's the 1.5%.
And if you think about that historically, I mean, we had about a $4 billion tax base. So that means you have to have 40 million, so to put this in perspective, you gotta have $40 million of net new construction in the community to get a 1% increase in our revenue.
I mean, we just approved a project like that tonight.
That won't be on the books though for 2 years.
Right.
Or at least 2 years, it won't be on the,
And again.
Tell me it's helpful though.
oh yeah, absolutely. It's
Absolutely.
critical.
And so, you know, the 1.5 is based on our historical net new construction. If we exceed that, that would be great. And remember, these are 5-year projections based upon those assumptions. Catherine, you had something?
Yeah, Jay, you mentioned something, I don't think I'm gonna paraphrase it correctly, but something about slowing the increase. Can you give an example of what you mean by that?
I'll get to that in the next, I'll get to that in the next couple slides.
But just to clarify.
Because I don't want to just bring you a problem.
Right, so what he's saying is that with all those projections that we had and assumptions, you know, we would go from 43 to 44 to 45, you know, on up. And in order to have a balanced budget, we have to figure out how maybe, you know, instead of this going up to, you know, to 40 or 54 or 3, you know, it's gotta come up about $400,000 less than that. So what do we need to do to make that happen? And that's what we're gonna talk about.
Does your bottom line assume the capital transfer, the fund balance transfer?
Yes.
then?
Yes.
So it's,
Yep. So, based upon that projection, if we look back at the last 10 years of historical budgets, that's represented by the blue line. The blue dashed line is projecting that forward, and the red line is those expenditure numbers that I just gave you. So you can see that even those expenditure projections that I just gave you are less than what the historical trend has been, but we still can't afford it. And then this is a wrong slide. This was one of the mistakes. What this actually would show, if it was the correct slide, is that under that scenario that I just described, because we're having to make additional withdrawals from fund balance to fund operations, by 2020 we fall out of compliance with our fund balance policy. The 2020 number I think it's down to about 13% on the final bar. So under that scenario, we would fall out of compliance with our fund balance policy. So here's where we start to look at solutions. And this is the same graph that you just saw, except now I've added a little bit green line below the red one. It might be kind of hard to see, but that's where we need to be. That's where we need to, our expenditure numbers need to be in 2017 through 2021 in order to continue to comply with our all of our policies, all of the financial policies that this city council has adopted. So what do those numbers look like? The first section up here are the projections that I shared with you just a second ago. The second set of numbers are how those projections would need to be revised in order to keep us in compliance with our policies. And as you can see, rather than having a $53.3 million operating budget in 2017, our operating budget would need to be about $53,196,000. So we would need to reduce the increase, if you will, by about 120 some odd thousand dollars. Now, the highlighted row under that revised section still indicates that that's an increase of about $927,000 from the prior year. So it's still an increase from the prior year, but not as much of an increase as our projection would have indicated. Same thing for all of the years. We continue to be able to increase the operating budget, but not by as much as all of those projections. So that means that Dale and I and the department heads have to go to work and figure out, okay, what are the things here that we can impact? In 2017, we know we're probably not going to impact wages because we've got settled contracts. Are there other big ticket items that we can impact? Can we touch health insurance? Can we make a difference in some other areas to reduce, can we find some efficiencies to reduce our operating expenditures to bring us into compliance with the council's policies? On average, that represents, I believe it's about $375,000 per year over the 5 years of this projection that we'll need to find savings within the operating budget.
But you're not suggesting an average, you're suggesting we take each year and deal with the numbers,
Well,
the normative numbers.
We'll have to deal with each year as it comes.
So-
But we can, if we make a larger reduction in the budget in 17,
Yeah,
that helps us in all subsequent years.
so leave no stone unturned,
Right.
I guess.
What that does, and one of the reasons we wanted to do this is it lets us look further down the road than just the annual, from what do we have to do this year? And this is telling us that we need to deal with about, $400,000 a year. And so that's a discussion we can start to have with the department directors to have, some longer term changes to that expenditure trend rather than, okay, here's this year what you have to solve, they solve it, and then, we wait till next year.
And even though this is the general fund, because it includes capital transfers, you can be looking at the capital budget as well, right?
Well,
So that you
Yeah.
wouldn't have to transfer
So-
as much from
so-
this to the capital budget.
They're related, but here's part of the challenge. Think of this in terms of steps. You have the operating budget. At the end of the year, the operating budget has hopefully a surplus, meaning we didn't spend all the money that we had. That money then goes into the fund balance, and then we say, okay, how much of the fund balance do we want to use towards capital projects? So the real issue there, although there is a tie to the operating budget to the capital budget, the direct link there is, how much money we were left over with at the end of the year. It's not that we're taking money straight from that operating budget and moving it over into capital. Our ability really is, we look at that fund balance and we say, we contributed $3 million to the fund balance. It's within our policy. That means we can take $3 million out and put that towards capital. To the extent that he said, Jay was talking about that we want to be within 1% of the revenues and 3% of the expenses. If those become inaccurate or don't work, and we no longer have that $2.7 to $3 million going into the fund balance every year, that's when we'll have to have the discussion about how much do we have, to be able to transfer out. And historically, that's been in that $2.5 to $3 million range that, we've underexpended our budget every year, which has allowed that transfer to the surplus, and then we can say, well, that's available for our policy to move back out. Does that help?
Now,
So we may not have a surplus though.
and there is, as Dale said, there is a relationship, but we can't reduce capital expenditures and apply those savings to the general fund, because we're funding all of the capital expenses from fund balance.
Right.
So we can't use fund balance to fund operations. On the other hand, we can reduce operations to help fund capital.
Right. So if you had
So-
your
but it
revenue
doesn't
the
go the other
same,
way.
yeah, if you had the revenue the same and less expense, that means there's more money left over at the end of the year that goes into the surplus bucket or the fund balance bucket, which would then be available.
So may I offer some, my thoughts about this 5-year projection? I see the value of having this longer view. I think like Bob said tonight, I hope it doesn't become, we don't become slaves to the 350,000 a year.
Right.
Such that each year, something could happen, you know, maybe we annex the town of Washington or something.
Right.
Don't write that. But some big things can happen, so
Yeah, absolutely.
we should always say, oh, okay, this year is really important and we ought to think about those years, but we don't wanna be slaves.
And I don't see this as being a static document. I hope to have this same discussion with the city council every single year at about this same time. And we keep updating it, and you're absolutely right, things will happen. And so it needs to be a living, breathing plan that we update and move forward with.
And I would reiterate that this is intended to just understand that gap so that we can do for longer range planning. But absolutely, if we had something that changed, you know, that those assumptions, you know, may have to change, the reality may change. I mean, you'll see that we're working on some things with health insurance, and we might be comfortable regularly budgeting something less than 5% if we can make some changes. So, you know, and that you can see we got $500,000 a year of increase just going to health insurance. A few percentage points on that, you know, could be very meaningful.
Mhm.
Well, the state might lift the levy limits.
The state could lift
Or they
limits.
might put a floor back in, it used to be a 3% floor.
Or they could take away personal property.
Well,
After
I
2018.
agree though, I think this is very helpful because all we've had before, we have these lines going like this and you're supposed to scare the bejeebers out of us, but you're not really sure.
What went into that?
Well, what is
Right.
it? And then I think
Yeah.
that's helpful.
And I really, the intent of none of this is just to scare people.
Well,
We need to
yeah.
know where we're going, but, you know, I think again, what this is showing is that on average,
Yeah.
under this scenario, we can increase the operating budget by about $800,000 a year. It's not a decrease, but it's just not, you know, what some of our projections would indicate. The last row on this table is one that I want to point out because I think that it's important for all the city council members to understand that the impact on a $150,000 home under this scenario, and granted it's a scenario based upon a lot of assumptions, is about $25 a year over the 5-year period. So if that's not acceptable, then you know that assumes that we're levying to the statutory what we're allowed under state statute. It also makes assumptions about how much debt we're going to issue.
Right, related to the capital.
Exactly. So, but you know that is a number that right now we can have an effect on by changing assumptions. So this is the chart that you just saw earlier that was in the wrong place and is also in this place. But if we make these adjustments and we chart our course a little bit differently, 2020 will still be in compliance with our fund balance policy. It will be going down because we will be drawing more out of fund balance than we're putting back into it, but we still will be in compliance with our fund balance policy. So, just kind of summarizing what we just talked about, and I am getting towards the end, I may make 45 minutes. How we're proposing to close some of these gaps is that we would need to increase property tax to the statutory maximum. We're gonna make capital transfers of about $3 million per year, which is what we've been doing. So that's really the status quo. We're going to use the unassigned fund balance to fund that capital transfer, as we have been doing for the last several years. And we need to reduce operating expenses by $375,000 per year on average. And that will change. This will be a living and breathing plan.
It's reduce the operating expenses,
From the projection.
right.
From the projection.
Exactly.
From the
Reduce the
projection.
increase.
Right, this is,
Exactly.
right,
Yeah,
this is
it
not
looks different.
reducing from, zero.
Right.
So you're gonna start this year with that $375,000,
I'm gonna be working towards it.
Well, that-
are you?
I'm gonna be working,
Well, remember that first year was 120
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I think it'll be working more towards the 120 this year, but we gotta understand that in the future years, it's gonna be a
then
little
it's,
bit.
then it's more in the future years, so.
Right.
Well, that would be
So-
covered by that little pile of, like, office supplies, never change.
Right.
Count the paper clips, we'll bring them in. So,
Make-
We'll get to work on that.
And don't we always
Go to
levy
2.5.
in the max?
Not
Not
always.
always.
Okay, 1 year.
1 year.
In 2009, we did it, all right. But since then.
But we'll keep reminding you of that.
Not that we would
It's like
ever,
a bad penny. It keeps
not that
coming
we
back.
would ever remember that.
And remember, I did calculate a number of how much levy we've given up
I
over
know,
the
I
time.
know.
So let's talk more specifically about the
The CIP.
2017 through 2021 CIP, which we are currently working on. These are really the same priorities that I talked to council about last year, and basically come out of our budget policy. But that resources should be provided for the maintenance of existing infrastructure and facilities and the timely replacement of equipment. In other words, we want to take care of what we have. We want to maintain what we have. Resources should also be provided for the continued growth of our community. Those would get more to the kind of the new investments in our infrastructure and in our community. One of the questions is, are there other priorities that we should be considering when we're evaluating projects that are submitted by departments for the capital program? So, I'm going to kind of throw that out as an open question at this point. If there are other priorities, we can talk about them here, or feel free to Dale or I a call or emails or whatever. But that's certainly something that would be helpful for us as we go through and evaluate the request and assemble the 2017-2021 CIP.
Well, what about, can we say that our water from, well to wastewater infrastructure is now like, check, good, we're in good shape?
Not completely. There's still some work at the water plant that you're gonna see coming forward.
And it's an every year thing. I mean, I don't know that we can ever put a check mark on it. I mean, every year we're replacing on a routine basis, water mains and sewer mains that have reached the end of their expected life. We have to continue to do things at the water plant and the wastewater plant to keep those facilities operating. So, and you'll see that in the CIP, that there's a program every single year for replacement of a lot of those facilities.
Well,
So,
we probably won't see a $40 million
No,
expenditure.
No.
But, the water quality is on people's minds.
Absolutely.
And even there's the Great Lakes Compact that
The
our
Waukesha.
adjoining states are working on about
Yeah.
who gets to use water in the Great Lakes and all that, so. I don't know.
we have our aquifer is abundant. We're investing significant money right now replacing the filters at the water treatment facility, so that those will do an even better job of removing the manganese from the water system. So, I mean, we're continuing to invest in that capital infrastructure so that we provide the safest and best product we can.
And
to the
for us,
customers.
as we evaluate these requests that come in, taking care of what we have, is, for us, is the number one priority. And that gets right to, making sure that we can continue to provide the quality that we have. And so what we wanted to do is just double check with you that, our first priority is taking care of what we have. And the second one is making sure that we're putting, money into the resources to provide, for the growth for the community.
Those,
I have a third,
Yeah,
if anyone else was interested in that. It'd be something about quality of life or quality of place, something like a bridge across the Eau Claire River, lighting on the bridges, decorative treatments on the bridges, things that wouldn't necessarily go under maintenance of infrastructure or growth.
Quality of life, quality of
Something
place.
like that,
Right.
I don't know. Artistic, art, I don't know.
I agree
Well,
with
and-
that.
yeah,
In
and-
particular, the pedestrian bridge,
Yeah.
maybe we should
well,
talk
and
about it.
that's a really good observation and comment, because as all of you know from the different presentations we've had on economic development, what you consider economic development and improvements for economic development is changing. It's not necessarily just building a pad and waiting or building a spec building for somebody to come. It is building that quality of place, so that the people come and then the businesses will follow that. So, that is, I think, a tweak that we could certainly entertain
Absolutely.
and include.
I would agree that it's a priority below these two, but it's,
But it should be named.
We can add that.
Absolutely.
I would agree with what Kathy said. A CIP thing that I've been interested in since my first budget in 2012 has been bus shelters. And I'll use that as an example for maybe like realistic ways we can address some of the things that keep getting pushed back. When I saw that it was 2017, I remember I expended a little effort to try to get it moved up sooner, and then realized that's not gonna happen. We're not gonna get the federal dollars. That's in the pipe dream category as well. So, two things, wondering if one, in a situation like a bus shelter, if there isn't a different way to address that. One suggestion that I heard over the last couple of years is maybe we could do a policy where we require developers to put in a bus shelter. So we're not so reliant on ourselves coming up with the money, but shifting that responsibility. Last night was a good example where the language in the development agreement said something like, if the developer wants to do it, they should make it look similar to this. But there was no requirement, and I didn't think it would be very fair to amend it because we don't have a policy and just to single out one person. So thinking about, could we shift kind of that responsibility for certain criteria? And the second for bus shelters is just looking at advertising, just looking at what are other communities doing to address that, and maybe it's time for us to go on a date with Lamar and see what they have to offer, and maybe that's a good solution for us. Along with that, there have also been some suggestions that maybe we do a call for like artistic bus shelters where we're incorporating some of that quality of life. So I guess my point is using bus shelters is that I'm sensitive to the reality that we have less and less money every year and that things are tight. Are there other ways that we can approach those situations versus saying, we're gonna have to move that 2 columns to the right and we're just not gonna be able to get to it for a long time?
One of the discussions that we regularly have in the CIP, it's not only the expense, but it's how we're gonna pay for that. And so, the above the line can be, it can be from the top property tax base, it can be from other sources, it can be from grants, it can be, different things. So that is a discussion that we have with the department directors when they come forward. Because we don't ask them simply, well, what's the expense, but what are you proposing for the revenue, and where do you propose that comes from? And so, the more typical responses have been, tax levy or grants, but we are entering into more of those kinds of discussions to say, well, is it donations, or is it some other kind of fundraising, or is there some other way to fund that?
My last thing about bus shelters is that I realize we're talking about a 5-year span, but my understanding is that 2017 has been the year that we're gonna be able to put money towards bus shelters, and I won't have my dreams crushed if it's not 2017, just because of the reality of the situation. So how many more of those things are we going to see if indeed that is the case, and really what can we do to make sure we're not going without when maybe there's other options on the table for us to pursue?
Well, and at the risk of being Mr. Doomsday, the city council and the administration we're gonna have to, make some important decisions concerning our transit system very soon. I mean, bus shelters are one piece of it where we've been waiting for federal money, but bus replacements is another piece. And, their word is that to expect about replacement money for about one bus per year. Well, we can't live on one bus per year, and some of you may or may not be aware, this last year we bought a used bus from the city of, or from the Duluth Transit Authority and paid, what was it, about $12,000? Versus $250,000, $300,000,
Right.
north of that, $400,000, but it was to get us by,
Right.
because we literally have buses that.
And they have
they're-
more coming up.
Yeah.
We're gonna sharpen our pencils a little bit
Right.
more,
Take
so.
good care of them, Duluthians.
Yeah.
Well, and,
So-
the thing is, I mean, just going back to kind of developer thing, like, that has nothing to do with federal transit dollars.
No.
And I understand it's a hierarchy of needs. You have to have the mobile unit to get people from A to B and back to A and all of that. So what else can we do? We're not saying, gee whiz, that's too bad we don't have federal dollars. I get it.
Yeah.
There's gotta be another way. It's a third way.
David,
Question?
Those items that are on that screen right there were part of the strategic plan that we put together.
Mhm.
Are there other things in there that I cannot recall?
Well, there's specific items that are gonna come through. This really comes out of what do you say, our value statements, in the strategic plan related to capital. And as you recall, we have a whole section on, taking care of what we have, so.
Tim?
I think this is the right place. Ideas, things we'd like to see, and I agree with all the others. There's gonna be a list of things, and we'll work through that. But, when I look at development on the north side, and I've been starting to do some speculation for, one is, how do we attract more people to the area? How do we increase those values? So, history has loaded, functions got built in certain areas and other functions got built in other areas. So my laundry list would be short, but as former member Lewis brought up Riverview Park, where can we get some beach access? Call it a beach, call it sand instead of concrete to step over. Redo those bathrooms down there. When we get more access, we get people enjoying the quality of life. I've had a couple people contact me about dog parks on the north side. It's a big transportation to get all the way to where these are when you're coming from the far north. We talked briefly. It's not a great deal of expense. It's the land to find a donation or lease like we did, but the infrastructure is paid from the fees. But that's a quality of life. And then I would probably argue a community splash pool. And if you're not familiar with that's that smaller pool where the toddlers can play. It's a great thing. When you look at North and Memorial, they're close to the same population, about 1,300 attending North, about 1,600 at Memorial. So having things for families to do, having that there would be a really good. Or is that, it doesn't have to be a District 1 area. That's something saying from the library up, what can we do to help redevelop those neighborhoods?
Mm-hmm.
So it could be in various areas, but I wanted to get those just on the discussion or thought list.
Mhm. Thank you.
I don't know if this idea's been rattling around in my head, if I might say. When we talked about economic development and we were working on our TIF policy and all, the idea of an industry cluster, such like a technology park, for example, information technology. I don't know if that would be a CIP expenditure. I actually don't know we could make sure there's the information infrastructure and the marketing piece, to, I don't know if we expend capital dollars to create a technology park.
If we're looking at acquiring land, it's certainly, and constructing roads and water and sewer and those sorts
Yeah.
of things, it's certainly a capital expense.
I don't know what site-ready means to technology people, or I guess I'm thinking information technology, or the Momentum West and the site selectors said we should concentrate on precision manufacturing, and maybe we could create a precision manufacturing park. So that's an idea. I don't have any bones on that idea at all. Yeah.
And if I can just add to that, as we're looking at,
Meat.
you know, I definitely agree, and it also is now crossed over in the Internet of Things to three-phase power and data connections. Because the precision manufacturing is going to need industrial utilities as well as high-speed data connections. Those two are now very merging.
Do we have that?
We do in a lot of areas, so out at the gateway and that sort of thing. But any new I would say would be wise, and of course researchers can verify that, but those two now go hand in hand. Gives you that flexibility to make things, to inventory things, and supply chain, etc.
Three-phase power, why three-phase power?
Three-phase power is the most efficient power, it's the most affordable power, and anytime you start going over house currents and uses, you need that.
Well, a lot of manufacturing equipment requires three-phase.
It's the bigger motors.
We have three-phase downtown, just bring them downtown.
That's just one.
So if we just look at, and these are all great ideas, we really appreciate the feedback. If we look at the 2017 through 2016 through 2021 CIP, and look at what was in there for 2017 capital expenditures, almost 96% of what was in there were for maintenance items. Very similar to the 2016 CIP. It's almost all taking care of what we've got. There's actually very little, $545,000 for new stuff. I don't recall exactly what that was, but for what I would consider to be new items, not taking care of things that we have. And if we look at that by fund, and again, this is the last year's CIP basically, almost
Projecting what
yeah.
we thought we would do in seven.
Right.
And remember, people now are thinking, well, we'll be getting different requests, because that was 2 years out at that point, and now they're gonna be thinking 1 year out, so.
So about almost 70% of that CIP was for street improvements. The next biggest chunk at 22% was land, buildings, and equipment. We've got a fire station in there for 17. So big chunks, and parks and recreation and bridges really comprise the rest of that CIP. And these are just, again, the general fund types of expenditures, not water and wastewater, that are funded from user fees. Expenditures by funding source, about 62% of it was being funded through general obligation bonds, little bit through state aid, 22% from a general fund transfer, and about 13% through special assessment notes that would be repaid by assessments. And then you saw these charts last year. These are basically looking at our policies, our debt policy. This one restricts our debt to 3% of our equalized value. Remember, the state limit is 5% of equalized value. That's represented by the everything below the red. The council policy is the green area and everything below, and then the blue is where we're actually at. So you can see that we're staying well within the city council policy, and certainly well below the statutory requirement. We also have a policy that limits our debt service to less than 25% of our annual tax levy. You can see that in 2017, we're bumping right up against that, but it starts coming back down in 2018 a little bit. So we are staying within that debt service policy. And then lastly, on the council policies, debt is supposed to be less than 3 times our operating revenue, and once again, we're well within that particular guideline. So as far as the CIP goes, we talked about priorities, and we'll add to those. I think we talked about the distribution between maintenance and new projects, and we also did get some feedback on council projects that members would like to see included in this year's capital program. And so I guess on that note, that's really where I'd like to leave things. If there are capital projects that council members would like to see included, and there's some consensus on the part of the city council to include those projects, then we'd like to try to, work those in.
It's helpful for us to know that as we go into the discussions for the recommendation that we would be bringing back.
Will we have another discussion this
Oh,
year?
yes.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
So what, just in terms of process, so what will happen is, the departments have submitted their requests for CIP budgets, and we're going through an internal process of reviewing those. Then we will bring back a recommended CIP to you. And that's typically where you've had your first meeting before, is we're bringing forward to you a recommended CIP. This is intended to just kind of frame it, see if there's something, if any of those assumptions are something you say, boy, we don't really want those, or use a different assumption, or that, that we just wanted you to understand the framework that we're operating in, have an opportunity to change that if you felt so inclined, and give us ideas on what you might want in that CIP. We will go through our internal process, and then it'll come back to you just like it has before. Here's a recommended CIP, we'll go through it all, and you have the opportunity then as a council through your action to modify or change that any way you want before adopting it as a final CIP.
But if there are some items that there is some consensus on, like we heard the pedestrian bridge mentioned before, then we'd like that feedback to see if it's not in there, if we can try to work it in somewhere through our planning process, rather than getting to the review. Excuse me. And having it be added at the last second, like the fourth level on the parking structure or something like that.
Oh, just borrow for it.
The bus transfer
that's what we
station,
did.
where are we at with that?
You'd be a report from the committee at the next
meeting.
Next council meeting.
That's a priority, in my view.
Tim?
Thank you. This has been very good.
I guess I want to ask one following question. As we move forward in this process, we've talked about capital items, then we've talked about, that operation budget. Department heads are going to have to tighten belts. I'd really like to have that translated sometime into the English of, if we cut this service, this is what it's doing to public safety, this is what it's doing to parks, this is what it's doing there.
Right.
Because a number is one thing. Well, the pool will be manned for 20 minutes a day.
Right.
Other than that, operation will be fine.
So here,
We might not interpret that from the number,
right.
because I'm worried, I mentioned public safety, it's a large sector, then we have the other large sectors, and I don't remember all the ledges, but
So
we can better understand.
when we bring the budget back to you, we will let you know certainly now that you have this framework, we showed you the average is 375 per year. Now next year, it really only needs to be 120. If we do more than 120, that helps with that average. And so back to your question, Carrie. So we'll tell you what that number was that we modified those projections on, and then not only will tell you what the number is, we'll tell you what we did in that recommendation, and then again as council you can decide to say that's not how we want that to be solved or reconciled, and propose something else, and you'll have your discussion and have your votes, and we'll lay that out for you when we bring it
You're
back.
still gonna bring a 5-year CIP, right?
Yes.
And
Yep.
so, in that bridge we're talking about across the Eau Claire River?
We'll try
That
to,
doesn't have to be in 17, right?
No, it doesn't have to be in 17, but if we know we want to do it, there might be some expenses related to 17 to put the footings in for it, for a later,
Or 18.
or 18.
And you're thinking July or June is when we'll have our next kind of CIP discussion?
No,
May 24th.
May 24th is the
Okay.
first.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah,
Kathy
this will be the
sent
first
this
time.
to
So
us.
we will be bringing the recommendations back to you, and you'll have your first view of them on May 24th.
And
Do you have
getting,
time to work up any of these ideas prior to that?
Yeah,
You do?
yeah.
Oh. And I heard the transit center as a priority.
you'll be getting
Probably
a
has its
report on
own
that.
Right.
thing,
That's got plenty of thing to it.
yeah.
That's a complicated project.
Right.
But in getting back to your comments, Councilmember T-Walt, there are two things in the strategic plan related to exactly what you were talking about. One of them is continuing the conversation with the city council about establishing priorities.
To help guide these discussions for us.
Help guide these discussions for us as it relates to the operating budget. And the other discussion is about service levels, and to have a conversation with the city council about what are our service levels right now. When do we plow snow? I mean, it sounds pretty mundane, but
How long does the grass be? What do we want for
when do we
response
want to
times?
mow?
You
When do we
all-
want? So
And those might be some of the recommendations we'll come back with to address that number that is there. And as Jay's pointing out, eventually we'd like to get to a point where those decisions are placed in a framework of priorities that the council has been involved with in setting. I mean, we don't have time for that this year, but, eventually, if we have a set of priorities and those have been agreed to from a policy perspective, when we have to come back with those recommendations, it'll fit better, and you won't be going, well, I wonder what will it be this year? Because you'll have a sense of it, because we will have, laid some of that out in other work.
And you've assumed 1.5% salary increase,
Yes.
but you're gonna ask us about that before you build the whole budget, right? You're gonna ask us, do we want it to be 1.5 or 2 or?
A couple of points. One, that's a 1.5% cost, which is actually a 1.1. Were we gonna do another one of these before?
yes, we were planning to do
So,
another one of these
yeah,
before the operating budget.
So we will do another one of these before we do the operating budget, and that's where you'll have that opportunity to weigh in, more specifically on some of those assumptions for the operating budget.
And finally, we're gonna talk about fees sometime too, and if we're collecting all our indirect costs and administrative.
I've asked about that for 10 years.
I've asked them
I
for
just don't
5
think
years,
it's
and
coming.
I'm gonna ask it one more time. I give up. It's like this block.
So we're now going to enter the CIP discussions. Just before we start doing the operating budget, we'll do another one of these, but it'll be much more condensed because it'll go straight to more of the assumptions of that's where you'll give an opportunity to give us some direction on what you want us building into that, again, in the bigger parameters. And then we'll build an operating budget and bring it back to you in the fall.
Thank you, everyone.
This was a rebroadcast of the Eau Claire City Council work session meeting. This program was recorded and presented by Chippewa Valley Community Television. Chippewa Valley Community Television is made possible by continuing community support. If you would like to volunteer or make a donation, you can contact us by calling 715-839-5067 or on the web at www.cvctv.org.